Silas Thorne was counting the leaks in his roof. A pointless, miserable task. He did it every time the sky wept over the miserable town of Oakhaven. There were 7. No, 8. A new one had sprung up overnight, a dark, damp stain spreading like a disease across the already rotting thatch above his mother's long empty bed. Poverty was a kind of dampness, he always thought. It got into the walls, into your clothes, into your very bones, and you could never truly feel warm or dry again. He knew the rules of this life. Rule 1. Keep your head down. The world had no time for a failed scholar's apprentice with a hacking cough and hands better suited for turning pages than swinging an axe. Rule 2. Never owe a debt you cannot pay. His parents had broken that rule, and the weight of their mistake now sat on Silas's shoulders. A ledger book heavier than any tombstone, owned by the unsmiling Lord Peton, and especially Rule 3, the most important rule in the shadow of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains. Never, ever trust an orc. They were monsters, savages, broken things from a broken land. But when he stumbled through the sodden gloom of the Whisperwood, hunting for mushrooms that probably weren't poisonous, he found her, an orc, a giant of a woman, chained to the crumbling stone of a forgotten watchtower. She was bleeding from a gash on her side, her powerful green-skinned frame slumped in exhaustion, her breath coming in ragged, shallow puffs. And huddled beneath her arm, shielded from the rain, was a small orc child, shivering and silent. Silas found Vroma, broken and desperate, and that choice, the one he made in the cold, dripping silence of the ancient woods, changed everything. The air was thick with the smell of rain on dust and decaying leaves. Every instinct screamed at him. Run, hide, forget what you saw. This was not his problem. He had enough problems. He had the debt. He had the hunger, a dull, familiar ache in his gut. He had the crushing loneliness of his parents' derelict cottage. Adding a monster to that list seemed like a particularly foolish brand of suicide. He looked at her, at the raw, chafed skin around the thick iron manacles on her wrists. He saw the way her massive shoulders curled, a protective shield around the small, terrified form of her child. He had seen that look before. In the mirror, the desperation of a cornered animal trying to protect the one thing it had left. For his parents, it had been him. For him, it was the worthless, rusty key in his pocket, the only thing he had left of them. It unlocked a chest that held nothing but dust and regret, a physical reminder of a debt he could never repay. It was a symbol of being trapped, just like her. The child whimpered, a sound so small and pitiful it cut through the wall of prejudice Silas had built around his heart. He looked from the child's frightened eyes to the mother's. Her eyes were a startling amber, and they weren't filled with malice or bloodlust. They were filled with an exhaustion so profound it felt ancient, and a sliver of defiance. A single, burning ember in a sea of ash. Honor. It was a word he'd only read in books, but he saw it in her gaze. He couldn't leave them. His fatal strength, his complete inability to ignore suffering, took over. He was a weak man. The village boys had always reminded him of that, frail, sickly. But his will, forged in the quiet libraries of his youth and tempered by years of solitary hardship, was iron. I can help," he whispered. The words felt absurd, mice squeaking at a mountain. The orc woman, Vroma, tensed. A low growl rumbled in her chest, a sound like grinding stones. She shifted her weight, trying to pull the child further behind her. It was a movement of pure, protective instinct. She expected a trick. She expected cruelty. It was all her kind ever received from his. Silas held up his empty hands. They trembled slightly, from the cold, from the fear. "I'm not a soldier. I'm not a hunter." He coughed, a dry, rasping sound that shook his thin frame. "I'm just hungry, like you." He approached slowly, his boots squelching in the mud. He knelt and examined the chains. They were crude, heavy, linked to a thick iron ring bolted into the stone wall. The lock was a massive, rusted monstrosity. He reached into his pocket and his fingers closed around the familiar shape of the rusty key. He pulled it out. It was small, delicate, completely useless against such a brutal mechanism. He stared at it for a long moment. A key that opened nothing. A promise that led nowhere. He tossed it aside into the mud. Some things couldn't be unlocked. They had to be broken. He looked around, his eyes scanning the forest floor. He found a large, heavy rock, half buried in the moss. It was a struggle to lift it. His arms screamed in protest. His back ached. He was panting by the time he heaved it over to the wall. He looked at Varoma. Her amber eyes watched his every move, wary, calculating. She didn't understand. "This is going to be loud," he said, more to himself than to her. He raised the rock and brought it down on the chain. The clang of stone on iron was deafening. It echoed through the quiet woods like a thunderclap. The chain barely dented. Vroma flinched at the sound, pulling her child tighter. Silas ignored the stinging in his hands, the jarring shock that traveled up his arms. He lifted the rock again, and again, and again. It was a frantic, desperate rhythm. The sound of a weak man trying to break an unbreakable thing. His breath came in ragged gasps. Sweat mingled with the rain on his face. His muscles burned. He felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the prelude to a coughing fit that would leave him breathless and dizzy. But he didn't stop. He thought of the ledger book on his table. He thought of Lord Peaton's sneering agent. He thought of every villager who had ever looked at him with pity or contempt. Each strike was a blow against all of it, against the debt, against the loneliness, against the rules that said he should leave this woman and her child to die. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a link groaned. It bent. A hairline fracture appeared. With a final guttural cry, Silas slammed the rock down one last time. The link snapped. The chain fell away from her right wrist with a heavy clatter. He dropped the rock, his arms feeling like limp, useless things. He leaned against the damp wall, gasping for air, a fit of coughing finally racking his body. When he recovered, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, he saw Vroma staring at the broken chain, then at him. The wariness in her eyes was still there, but now it was joined by something else. Disbelief. He didn't give her time to think. He picked up the rock again, his body protesting every movement, and started on the second manacle. It was harder this time. His strength was gone. Each blow was weaker than the last. But he persisted, driven by a stubbornness that had seen him through countless hungry nights. Vroma watched him, her expression unreadable. She saw this tiny, fragile human, a creature she could snap in two with one hand, expending the very last of his energy to free her. He wasn't doing it for profit. He wasn't doing it for glory. He was doing it because he had decided to. The simplicity of it was alien to her. The second chain broke. Vroma was free. She didn't move immediately. She slowly, stiffly, rubbed her raw wrists. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the drip of water from the leaves and Silas's ragged breathing. "Come with me," he said, his voice hoarse. "My home. It's not much, but it's dry. There's a little food." She looked down at her son, Grok, who peeked out from behind her leg, his wide, dark eyes fixed on Silas. Then she looked back at Silas. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The journey back was a slow, painful affair. Vroma was weak from blood loss and starvation, leaning heavily on the crumbling wall of the watchtower as she stood. She was immense, a head and a half taller than Silas, her shoulders as broad as a doorway. Even weakened, her presence was overwhelming. She took one step, then staggered, her leg threatening to buckle. Without thinking, Silas moved to her side, offering his own thin shoulder for support. It was absurd. He was a sapling trying to prop up an ancient oak. She looked down at him, a flicker of surprise in her amber eyes, but she accepted the gesture. She leaned just enough of her weight on him to stay upright, careful not to crush him. They made their way through the woods, a strange and mismatched pair. The giant, wounded warrior, the frail, coughing scholar, and the silent, watchful child. When they finally reached the edge of Oak Haven, Silas led them along the back paths, sticking to the shadows, his heart pounding with a new kind of fear. Not the fear of a monster, but the fear of his own people. His cottage was more of a hovel, slumped at the very edge of the village as if trying to shrink away from it. The roof sagged, the wood of the walls was grey and splintered. He pushed open the creaking door and ushered them inside. The single room was dim and smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. A small, cold hearth dominated one wall. A rickety table with one chair, a lumpy straw mattress in the corner, and a scattering of books were the only furnishings. Vroma had to duck her head to get through the door, and once inside, she seemed to fill the entire space. She sank to the floor by the hearth, her injured legs stretched out in front of her. Grok immediately scrambled into her lap, burying his face in her tunic. Silas moved with a sense of urgent purpose. He stirred the embers in the hearth, adding a few precious sticks of kindling until a small, hesitant flame flickered to life. He filled his only pot with water from the rain barrel and hung it over the fire. Into it, he sliced the last of his onions and the handful of tough, stringy carrots he'd managed to buy last week. It would be a thin, watery soup, but it would be warm. While the water heated, he approached Vroma. "Your side," he said softly. "I have some clean rags and boiled water." She watched him, her silence a heavy weight, but she didn't stop him. He gently lifted the edge of her leather tunic. The gash was deep, ugly, and crusted with dirt and dried blood. It needed to be cleaned. He worked carefully, his touch surprisingly gentle as he washed away the grime with a warm, damp cloth. Vroma hissed in pain as he cleaned the wound, her whole body tensing, but she didn't pull away. Grok watched him, his little fists clenched. When the wound was clean, Silas tore a strip from one of his old shirts, one of the few things he had left from his father, and bound it tightly around her torso. His fingers brushed against her warm green skin. It felt like leather, strong and resilient. He finished and sat back on his heels, exhausted. The soup was simmering, its meager aroma filling the small room. He ladled it into 2 chipped wooden bowls. He gave the first to Vroma. She took it, her large hands dwarfing the bowl. She didn't drink. Instead, she blew on it carefully, cooling it, before holding it out to Grok. The child drank greedily, his eyes never leaving Silas. Only when Grok had finished did Vroma drain the bowl herself, in 3 long swallows. She looked at the empty bowl, then at Silas, who was sipping his own small portion. He saw it then, the moment of bonding, the moment of... In the quiet warmth of the fire, over a shared meal that was barely more than hot water, he saw the wall of prejudice begin to crumble. He wasn't a human. She wasn't an orc. They were 2 outcasts, 2 desperate souls, finding a moment of peace in a world that had offered them none. He, the debtor, she, the deserter, both trapped, both broken, and now both sharing the same roof, the same silence. If you believe that kindness matters more than species, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps us share more stories about unlikely heroes. Now, back to Silas's decision, because things were about to get dangerous. The days that followed settled into a strange, silent routine. A domestic struggle played out in the cramped confines of the hovel. Vroma's presence was a constant, overwhelming reality. The floorboards groaned under her weight. The low ceiling forced her into a perpetual stoop. She moved with a warrior's contained grace, but the small cottage was like a cage for her, and Silas could feel her coiled energy, her frustration at her own weakness. Her wound healed slowly. Silas changed the dressing every day, using up his last clean rags. He shared his pitifully small stores of food without a second thought. A handful of dried beans here, a stale crust of bread there. Hunger was a constant companion, a gnawing emptiness that made his head spin. But for the first time in a long time, the hunger was not a lonely affliction. It was shared. Grok was the first to thaw. The small orc child, who had at first hidden behind his mother, like a frightened shadow, began to watch Silas with a cautious curiosity. Silas, remembering fragments from the books on child rearing he'd once catalogued, would leave small things for him to find. A smooth river stone, a brightly colored feather. One afternoon, while Vroma slept, her body demanding rest to knit itself back together, Silas sat at his table and folded a piece of scrap parchment into the shape of a bird. He slid it across the floor towards the boy. Grok stared at it, then scurried forward and snatched it up. He examined it with intense focus, his little tusks just barely visible as he poked at the paper wings. A tiny guttural sound of delight escaped him. It was the first sound Silas had heard him make, other than whimpers of fear. It was a victory that felt more profound than finishing any scholarly thesis. As Vroma's strength returned, she grew restless. She was a warrior, a provider. The helplessness grated on her honor. She watched Silas struggle to bring in firewood, his hacking cough worsening with each trip into the damp woods. She saw the way he rationed every bite of food, often giving the larger share to her and Grok, while he subsisted on little more than broth. One morning she stood up, testing her weight on her injured leg. It held. She walked to the door and looked up at the sagging, leaking roof. She grunted, a sound of profound disapproval. Then she walked out into the misty morning. Silas watched, confused and a little afraid, as she strode towards the small copse of trees at the edge of his property. She placed her hands on the trunk of a slender but tall pine tree. For a moment, she just stood there. Then, with a deep breath, she began to push. Her muscles bunched, the powerful lines of her back and shoulders standing out in stark relief. The tree resisted, the roots held fast. Vroma let out a low growl, a sound of primal effort, and pushed harder. There was a terrible tearing, splintering sound as the roots began to give way. The tree groaned, leaned, and then came crashing down. Silas stared, dumbfounded. She had just pushed over a tree. She then proceeded to snap the larger branches off over her knee, as if they were twigs. Within an hour, she had dragged the entire trunk back to the cottage, and, with an almost casual display of strength, hoisted one end onto the roof, wedging it into place as a new, massive crossbeam. The sagging spine of the roof immediately straightened. The noise, of course, attracted attention. Old Man Hemlock, his nearest neighbor, peeked out from behind his fence. His eyes went wide. He saw the giant orc woman on Silas's roof, manhandling a tree trunk as if it were a walking stick. He saw Silas, pale and thin, looking on from the doorway. Hemlock's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Then he scurried back inside, slamming his door shut. The damage was done. By noon, the entire village of Oakhaven knew. The monster was real. Silas Thorne, that strange bookish recluse, was harboring an orc in his house. Fear was a poison, and it spread quickly. Mothers pulled their children inside when Silas walked to the well. The baker, who would usually sell him day-old bread for a pittance, suddenly had none to spare. The whispers followed him everywhere. Monster lover, traitor. He was an outcast before, but now he was something worse. He was a threat. Prejudice was a wall, and the village was building it higher and stronger around his tiny cottage. The increased isolation made their situation even more desperate. With no one willing to sell to him, their food supply dwindled to nothing. Vroma could hunt easily. She could slip into the woods and return with a deer over her shoulders. But they both knew that would be a death sentence. A hunting orc so close to the village would bring the Baron's guards down on them in an instant. So they starved together, in the quiet solidarity of their shared prison. Then came the knock on the door. It wasn't the timid rap of a curious villager. It was a loud, arrogant, insistent banging. Heavy boots on the porch. Silas's heart sank. He knew who it was before he even opened the door. Howell Critch stood there, a sneering, rat-faced man who served as Lord Peaton's agent and debt collector. He was flanked by two burly men who looked like they'd been carved from stale bread and bad intentions. "Thorn," Critch said, his voice dripping with condescension. He didn't wait for an invitation, pushing past Silas into the cottage. His eyes immediately fell on Vroma, who had risen to her full, intimidating height by the hearth. Grok was half hidden behind her leg. Critch's sneer widened into a cruel grin. Well, what have we here? The ledger says you owe Lord Peaton for the cottage, the land, and your parents' outstanding accounts. It doesn't say anything about entertaining livestock. Vroma's hand went to the handle of the hunting knife Silas had given her to chop vegetables. A low growl started in her throat. "She's my guest," Silas said, his voice shaking only slightly. He stepped between Critch and Vroma, a pathetically small shield. Critch laughed, a short barking sound. "Your guest, Thorn. You can't afford to feed yourself, let alone this thing. The debt is past due, again. Lord Peaton is a patient man, but his patience has limits. Payment is expected by week's end." He looked Vroma up and down, a calculating glint in his eye. "And now there will be a surcharge, a risk premium, for the exotic nature of your house guest. The total has been adjusted." He named a sum that was so astronomically high, it was laughable. It was a life's earnings for a dozen farmers. It was a death sentence. There was no way Silas could ever pay it. They wanted him gone. They wanted the land. The orc was just the excuse they needed. "That's impossible," Silas whispered. "Impossible is your problem, not mine," Critch snapped. "Week's end, Thorn, or we'll be back to take possession of the property, and we'll deal with your pets." He let his gaze linger on Grok for a moment. A clear, vile threat. With that, he turned and strode out, his thugs following him. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving a profound and desperate silence. Silas slumped against the table, the world tilting around him. He couldn't breathe. The debt, the hunger, the fear. It was all a great black wave crashing down on him. His vision swam. The familiar tightness seized his chest, but this time it was worse. He gasped, but no air came. Black spots danced in his eyes. He was falling. He felt strong arms catch him before he hit the floor. Vroma. She lifted him as if he weighed nothing and carried him to the straw mattress. She laid him down gently. He was shivering, his body caught in a violent coughing fit that left him weak and dizzy. That night, the fever took him. He drifted in a hazy world of pain and confusion. He was cold, so cold. The dampness of the cottage had finally gotten into his soul. He vaguely heard the sound of Grok crying. He felt a cool hand on his forehead. He saw Vroma's face swim above him, her amber eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't name. He was dying. He knew it. The long, slow decline of his life was finally reaching its end. He had failed his parents. He had failed to keep their home. And now he would fail these two strangers he had tried to save. His last coherent thought was of the rusty key, the symbol of his failure, broken promises, empty chests. He woke to a strange warmth spreading through his chest. The shivering had stopped. The ache in his bones had receded to a dull thrum. He opened his eyes. Vroma was kneeling beside him. Grok was asleep in the corner, clutching the paper bird. The fire in the hearth was burning low, casting long shadows. Vroma's hand was pressed flat against his sternum. A soft green light emanated from her palm, pulsing in time with his own heartbeat. It wasn't hot, but it was a deep and profound warmth, like sinking into a summer river. It felt like life. What are you doing?" he rasped. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and rough, like stones rubbing together. It was the first time she had said more than one or two words to him. "You are fading. Your spirit is thin, like a worn-out blanket." He could feel something flowing from her into him, a current of energy, of strength, of vitality. It pushed back the cold, filled the hollow places inside him. But he could also feel what it was costing her. He could feel her exhaustion, a weariness that went bone deep. "Stop," he said, trying to push her hand away. "You're hurt. You need your strength." "You spent your strength for me," she said simply, her gaze unwavering. "On the chains. You shared your food when you had none. You cleaned my wound. You gave my son a gift." She looked over at Grok. "You showed him kindness. Orcs have long memories for debts, and for kindness." She leaned closer. The green light brightened. "In my clan, we have a bond, an ancient right. It is not done lightly. It is for family, for those you would share a heart with. A heart would bond. It makes two spirits one. Your weakness will be mine. My strength will be yours. We will not be two outcasts anymore. We will be a clan of two." It was the boon, the supernatural gift he never asked for. It wasn't a spell for riches or power. It was something far more profound. A choice, a declaration, family. "It is a great risk," she murmured, her voice strained, "to share a soul with one whose life is so fragile. But you have an iron will. I saw it at the watchtower. I see it now. A warrior's spirit in a scholar's body." She pressed her hand harder against his chest. He felt a sharp, searing heat, like a brand. He cried out, a short, sharp gasp. The green light flared, engulfing them both for a moment, and then it was gone. Vroma slumped back, breathing heavily, sweat beading on her brow. The effort had cost her dearly. Silas lay on the mattress, breathing. But the breath was different. It was deeper. The tightness in his chest was gone. The persistent, nagging cough that had been his companion for years was silent. He could feel the steady, powerful beat of his own heart, and beneath it, a second, fainter rhythm. Hers. He could feel her exhaustion as if it were his own, but he could also feel the deep well of her physical strength, the unyielding core of her honor. He felt her fear for Grok, and her new, fragile, but fierce protectiveness of him. He sat up. The dizziness was gone. The world was sharp, clear. He looked at his hands. They were still thin, still pale, but they didn't tremble. He looked at Vroma, this giant, terrifying, and honorable woman who had just tied her fate to his, who had called him family. The wall of prejudice had been built by the village, but here, in this tiny hovel, Vroma had just opened a door, and Silas knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his new, shared soul, that he would die before he let anyone close it. Can you believe they did that? If you're rooting for this strange family to survive, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Comment below. Would you have opened your door? But hold on, because Lord Peton wasn't finished yet. The week passed in a blur of tense quietude. The Heartwood bond had changed everything. It was a silent conversation that flowed between them. Silas no longer needed to guess at Vroma's moods. He felt them. He felt her restlessness, her warrior's instinct screaming at her to act, to fight, to provide. And she, in turn, felt his quiet resolve, the scholar's mind that was now turning over their problem, searching for a solution that wasn't steeped in violence. The physical change in Silas was subtle, but profound. The cough was gone. A little color had returned to his cheeks, He could carry a full bucket of water from the well without his lungs burning, though he still felt the phantom ache of Roma's healing wound in his own side. They were a strange symbiosis, his mind clearer and sharper than ever, fueled by her vitality, her raw power tempered and guided by his caution and intellect. They talked more. In the evenings, by the light of the fire, she told him of her life. She spoke of the Bloodfang clan, of the harsh honor of their society. She spoke of Thrathrak Skull Render, her warlord, a powerful orc obsessed with conquest and glory, but who had forgotten the most important oath, to provide for the clan. He led the warriors on pointless raids while the young and the old starved. He valued power over honor. He demanded a blood tithe, Vroma said one night, her voice a low rumble of remembered anger. She was sharpening the small knife on a whetstone, a rhythmic, scraping sound. Every warrior had to sacrifice something: grain, weapons. Some sacrificed their own kin to his war host. He called it loyalty. I called it madness. Her desertion hadn't been an act of cowardice, but of rebellion. She had refused to let her son, Grok, become another offering on the altar of Thrathrak's ambition. She had fled in the night, taking nothing but her child. The warlord's hunters had caught up with her near the old watchtower. She had fought them, killing two, but had taken the gash in her side and been chained, left to die as a warning to others. Silas listened, his respect for her growing with every word. He had freed a deserter, yes, but he had freed a hero. He spent his days poring over the few books he owned, and the ones he remembered from the library. He was searching for a loophole, a forgotten law, anything. He read about the founding of Oakhaven, about the Baron's Charter. He was looking for a weapon made of words, the only kind he knew how to wield. The day of reckoning arrived with a grey, drizzling dawn. The end of the week. Critch returned, as promised. This time he brought not 2, but 6 guards, all armed with cudgels and grim expressions. The entire village seemed to turn out, drawn by the morbid spectacle. They stood at a distance, a ring of pale, fearful faces, their prejudice a palpable wall around the cottage. "Time's up, Thorn," Critch yelled from the muddy path. "The debt is due. Lord Peaton requires his property." Silas stepped out of the cottage. Vroma was right behind him, a looming silent shadow. Grok was inside, hidden under the mattress, told to stay silent no matter what he heard. Silas's heart was pounding, but he felt Vroma's strength flowing into him, a steadying current. His hands did not shake. "Lord Peaton has no claim on this property," Silas said, his voice clear and carrying in the damp air. Critch laughed. "Are you mad? The debt is recorded, signed by your own father." "A debt made under duress," Silas countered, his mind racing, pulling facts from his memory. "A debt of medicine to fight the red cough plague, sold at 1,000 times its value. That is not a debt, it is extortion. And the Baron's Charter, Article 4, Section 2, explicitly forbids profiting from plague." A murmur went through the crowd of villagers. Some of the older ones remembered the red cough. They remembered the carts. And they remembered Lord Peaton's father, selling the cure for a fortune. Critch's face darkened. "Ancient history. The ledger stands. Now, step aside, or my men will move you." As the guards started to advance, a new sound cut through the tension. The heavy rhythmic thud of war drums. It was a sound that Oakhaven hadn't heard in a generation. It came from the direction of the mountains. Everyone froze. The villagers looked at each other in terror. Even Critch and his thugs seemed unnerved. Over the rise they came. 3 orcs. They were massive, clad in black iron and cruel spikes. Their skin was scarred. Their eyes burned with malice. The one in the lead was the largest of all, a true monster of muscle and rage. On his shoulder, he carried a huge, double-bladed axe, its edge stained with old dark rust. Thrathrak's Skull Render had arrived. He ignored the humans completely, his burning eyes, full of a furious possessive light, fixed on Vroma. "Deserter!" he bellowed, his voice like an avalanche. "You broke your blood oath. You shamed the clan. I have come to collect the price." Here it was, the crisis, a pincer movement of greed and vengeance. On one side, the bureaucratic cruelty of Lord Piton, embodied by Critch and his thugs. On the other, the bloodthirsty honor of Thrathrak and his warriors. Silas and Vroma were trapped between them. Critch, seeing the warlord's attention focused elsewhere, saw his opportunity. "Now!" he shrieked at his men. "Get them out of the house!" The two forces moved at once. The village guards surged forward towards Silas. Thrathrak and his warriors advanced on Vroma. The muddy yard in front of the hovel was about to become a bloodbath, and in that moment of chaos, the weak human stood up for the strong orc. "Stop!" Silas's voice was not a shout. It was a command. It was so unexpected, so filled with a strange authority born of the heartwood bond, that for a second everyone actually stopped. The guards hesitated. Thrathrak paused, turning one eye toward this insignificant human who dared to speak. Silas walked forward, placing himself directly between the two advancing groups. He was a tiny island in a sea of violence. He pointed a trembling but determined finger at Critch. "You are agents of Lord Piton. You represent the laws of this barony, however twisted. Is that correct?" Critch, thrown off balance, could only nod dumbly. "It is." "Then you cannot stand by while a foreign force attacks a resident of this village on village land. The Baron's Charter guarantees protection to all residents within the boundaries of Oakhaven." He was weaving words, spinning a shield of rhetoric and law. He then turned to Thrathrak. His fear was a cold knot in his stomach, but he felt Vroma's strength, her pride, her honor, and he channeled it. "And you are Thrathrak's skull render," the warlord sneered. "You know my name, little man. That will not save you." "I know more than your name," Silas said, his voice gaining strength. "I know of the blood oath. I know of honor. And I ask you, warlord, what honor is there in hunting a mother who fled to save her child from a famine you created?" Thrathrak's eyes widened in fury. This was a private shame, a truth he had buried under a mountain of propaganda and fear. For this human to know it, to speak it aloud, it was unthinkable. "She is a liar, a coward who broke her oath." "She broke no oath," Silas declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "Her oath was to the clan, to the future of the Orc people. An oath you broke when you chose glory over their survival. Her flight was not cowardice. It was the ultimate act of honor, an act to preserve the clan's most precious asset, its children." A silence fell over the yard. The villagers stared, stunned. Critch's thugs looked confused. Even Thrathrak's own warriors shifted uneasily. They had families. They knew the whispers of starvation back home were true. This was the turning point. The confrontation was public. The truth was being laid bare. Vroma stepped forward to stand beside Silas. She placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity, of ownership, of family. And then she revealed her final, hidden value. "He speaks the truth, Thrathrak," she said, her voice calm and powerful. "But there is more. You cannot touch him." Thrathrak laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I can touch whomever I please. I will kill him for his insolence, and then I will drag you back in chains." "No," Vroma said. She held up her right hand, palm out. On it, a faint green sigil glowed, the mark of the heartwood bond. "This man is no longer just a human. He is my kin. He is of my blood, my spirit. We are heartwood bound. An attack on him is an attack on my own soul. It is a sacred taboo, a crime against the spirits of our ancestors. Your own warriors know this. To spill the blood of the bonded is to curse yourself and all who follow you." Thrathrak's face went pale beneath his scars. He looked at the glowing sigil on Vroma's palm, then at Silas, who stood unwavering beside her. He looked at his own 2 warriors. He saw the doubt in their eyes, the fear, not of him, but of the ancient laws, the old magic. They would not follow him if he broke such a sacred taboo. They would not risk a curse that would follow them to their graves. His authority, built on fear and brute force, was crumbling. This weak, pathetic human and this traitorous female had undone him with words and ancient traditions. At the same time, from the back of the crowd of villagers, a new figure pushed his way forward, a portly man, dressed in fine velvets that were now spattered with mud. He was sweating, his face a mask of fury. Lord Peton himself, drawn from his manner by the commotion and the sound of war drums. "What is the meaning of this?" he blustered, his eyes falling on Silas. "Critch, seize this man, seize the property. I will not have my authority questioned by this bookworm." Silas turned his full attention to the landlord. The final piece of his plan. "Lord Peton, you have no authority here, not anymore." He raised his voice for all the villagers to hear. "For 2 generations your family has held this town in its grip with a fraudulent debt. You have profited from plague. You have kept good families in poverty, all based on a lie." He pulled a folded, yellowed piece of parchment from his pocket. It was a hand-drawn copy of a map he had found in one of his father's old books. "The Baron's Charter grants this land, this cottage, and the woods behind it, in perpetuity, to the family of the village healer, as a reward for services rendered during the Greybone fever a century ago. That healer was my great-great-grandmother, Alara Thorne." He pointed to Lord Peton. "Your grandfather falsified the records after the Red Cough Plague, claiming the land as payment for a debt that was never owed, on a property that was never his to claim. This house, this land, has belonged to my family all along. You are the debtor, Lord Peton. You owe my family a century of rent." The crowd gasped. It was a shocking revelation. The foundation of Peton's power in the village was his ownership of the debt. Silas had just demolished it. Lord Peton's face turned a shade of purple. "Lies! Forgery! I will have you hanged." "Will you?" Silas challenged, his voice ringing with the force of truth. "The original charter and the real maps are in the Baron's archives in the capital. I read them myself during my apprenticeship. Shall we send a rider to the Baron and ask him to adjudicate, to see who is the liar and who is the thief? Checkmate." Lord Peton's power was a house of cards, and Silas had just pulled out the bottom one. The landlord stared, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. He was publicly shamed, his entire wealth and status revealed as a fraud in front of the very people he had oppressed for so long. The confrontation was over. Thrathrak, facing a mutiny from his own warriors and the breaking of a sacred law, was powerless. Lord Peton, exposed as a fraud, was ruined. Thrathrak spit on the ground. "This is not over, deserter," he snarled at Vroma, but there was no heat in it. It was the empty threat of a defeated man. He turned and stalked away, his warriors following at a distance, their loyalty to him clearly broken. He was exiled not by a sword, but by the truth. Lord Peton, sputtering with impotent rage, turned and fled, pushing his way through the crowd of villagers who now looked at him not with fear, but with utter contempt. His reign of debt was over. In the muddy yard, in the sudden, ringing silence, only 3 people were left standing. Silas, Vroma, and in the doorway of the cottage, Grok, who had finally peeked out. Silas felt the tension drain out of him, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He swayed on his feet. Vroma's hand on his shoulder tightened, holding him up. He had done it. The weak, sickly scholar had faced down a warlord and a corrupt lord, and he had won. Not with muscle, but with knowledge. Not with a sword, but with kindness. The resolution began not with a cheer, but with a single, small action. Old man Hemlock, who had been the first to see Vroma and spread the word of the monster, shuffled forward. He held out a lumpy sack. "Potatoes," he mumbled, not looking at Silas, but at Vroma. "The roof. It's a good beam." That small act broke the spell. It was an apology, an offering, a beginning. Another villager came forward, the baker, holding a fresh, warm loaf of bread. "For the boy," he said, nodding towards Grok. Soon, a small pile of offerings lay at their feet. Vegetables, a skin of milk, a small wheel of cheese. It was an outpouring of shame and gratitude. They had seen Silas's courage. They had seen Vroma's honor and her fierce maternal love. They had seen a family standing together against injustice. And in that moment, they stopped seeing a monster and an outcast. They just saw people. The happy ever after wasn't instantaneous. It was built, day by day, like a new house. The villagers, freed from the shadow of Piton's debt, began to change. Led by Hemlock, a group of them came to Silas's cottage the next day. They didn't just bring food, they brought tools, lumber, and fresh thatch. They worked together. The men who had once mocked Silas for his weakness now listened as he, guided by Vroma's practical eye, directed the repairs. Vroma's strength was no longer a source of fear, but a marvel. She lifted beams into place that took 4 men to carry. Her movements efficient and powerful. The villagers watched in awe as she worked, a quiet respect replacing their fear. The cottage was transformed. The leaking roof was rethatched, thick and even. The flimsy walls were reinforced. The door was rehung on new iron hinges forged by the blacksmith, who refused any payment. Inside, the single room was expanded. A small second room was built for Grok, giving him his own space. The hearth was rebuilt, stone by stone, so that it drew perfectly and filled the home with warmth. The debt was gone. The house was fixed. A new community was being forged in Oakhaven. One built on mutual respect. Different didn't mean enemy. They learned that a scholar's mind and an orc's strength were both valuable. They learned that compassion was a weapon stronger than any sword. Vroma found a new role. She became the village's unofficial protector. When a rockslide blocked the mountain pass, she cleared it in a single afternoon. When a pack of wolves grew bold, she hunted the alpha and drove the rest away. Her presence a more effective deterrent than any wall. She taught the village children how to track, how to read the signs of the forest. Grok, no longer hiding, played with the human children, his guttural laughter mixing with their high-pitched shrieks. He was just another boy. Silas, in turn, became the village's heart. Freed from the weight of the debt and the frailty of his own body, he flourished. He established a small school, teaching not just the children but the adults how to read and write. He became their archivist, their negotiator, their counsel. The heartwood bond remained, a quiet, constant current between him and Vroma. It was a secret they kept, a private magic that fueled their strange, wonderful family. He still felt her aches, she still felt his moments of intellectual frustration, and they would smile at each other across a crowded room, sharing a secret no one else could understand. One evening, months later, the 3 of them sat before the warm, crackling fire in their new sturdy home. The smell of roasting rabbit, a gift from Hemlock, filled the air. Grok was asleep on a soft new rug, the old paper bird still clutched in his hand. Silas looked at Vroma. The firelight played across the strong planes of her face, softening her features. The amber eyes that had once held only exhaustion and defiance now held a deep, quiet contentment. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old rusty key. He had found it in the mud outside the watchtower and kept it. He looked at it, this symbol of his former hopeless life. It had represented a locked door, an empty promise. But he had been wrong. He had used kindness to bypass a lock of prejudice. He had used knowledge to break the chains of debt. He had stood for another, and in doing so, had found his own strength. He didn't need the key anymore. He reached over and gently placed it in Vroma's large, calloused hand. She closed her fingers around it. "A small, worthless thing," she rumbled softly. "No," Silas said, his voice full of an emotion that made his throat tight. "It's the key that opened my home to you. It's the key that started our family." She looked from the key to his face, and for the first time, he saw her smile. It was a small, hesitant thing, but it transformed her face, filling it with a fierce and beautiful warmth. She held the key to her heart, a silent acknowledgement. A choice had been made in the woods that day, a choice to break a rule, and that choice had not just changed everything. It had built everything: a home, a community, a family. And that is how a poor human and a deserting orc mother proved that family is a choice, not blood. If this story touched your heart, please smash that like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories about compassion overcoming fear. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even a rusty key can open a future. Thanks for watching.